two engines helped shape the muscle car wars of the late 1960s, yet they did so in completely different ways. On one side stood Chevrolet's 427 Big Block, a purebred racing motor adapted for street use. On the other was Ford's 428 Cobra Jet, a street-friendly powerhouse designed with one purpose in mind: dominate the quarter mile and embarrass rivals at the stoplight. While the Chevy 427 represented years of motorsport development packed into a production engine, the Ford 428 CJ was a clever blend of existing parts, tuned and engineered to punch far above its conservative ratings. Chevrolet launched its Mark IV 427 in 1966, a culmination of hard lessons learned from NASCAR ovals, Can-Am racing, and drag strip experimentation. It was the engine that cemented the Corvette's legendary status, with outputs ranging anywhere from 390 to more than 550 horsepower, depending on configuration. Built without compromise, the 427 was Chevrolet's declaration that performance mattered more than cost or complexity. Ford, however, took a very different route. In April 1968, it introduced the 428 Cobra Jet, a motor that looked tame on paper at just 335 horsepower, but proved far more potent in the real world. Instead of building a race engine for the street, Ford engineered a street motor that could outwit the competition, using torque, traction, and understated design as its secret weapons. The 427's backstory stretched years before its official debut. Chevrolet had already teased enthusiasts with the mysterious 427 Z11 in 1963, essentially a stroked 409, produced in limited numbers for drag racing. That same year, the so-called mystery motor appeared at Daytona, revealing the innovative architecture that would define the Mark IV family: true combustion chambers in the heads rather than in the block, revised valve angles for better breathing, and a square 90-degree deck that enhanced volumetric efficiency. By the time the production 427 arrived in 1966, it was clear this was a no-nonsense performance platform built to dominate. Ford's journey to the 428 Cobra Jet was much more pragmatic. The 428 cubic inch V8 had existed since 1966, mostly powering big cars like Thunderbirds and Galaxies. It wasn't until Rhode Island dealer Bob Tasca began modifying these engines for Mustangs that the potential became undeniable. His dealer-built creations, nicknamed King of the Road, consistently outran Chevrolets and Mopars on the street. Ford's engineers took notice, and Bill Barr spearheaded a crash program to build a production-ready performance 428. The result was ingenious. By combining the stout 428 bottom end with 427 low-riser heads, Ford created a motor that produced huge torque, delivered more horsepower than advertised, and still looked deceptively like a mild-mannered family car engine. Between 1966 and 1969, Chevrolet's 427 reached its prime. Buyers could choose from an entire spectrum of versions, ranging from the relatively mild 390 horsepower L36, which could even be found in full-size wagons, to the terrifying L88, a barely streetable race motor producing well over 500 horsepower. For enthusiasts, the L72 with 425 horsepower became a street favorite, while the triple-carb L71 offered 435 horsepower and eye-widening throttle response. The pinnacle came with the ZL1, a 560 horsepower all-aluminum version so expensive that only a handful of Corvettes and Camaros were ever produced. Ford's 428 Cobra Jet, meanwhile, didn't chase exotic specs or astronomical horsepower numbers. Instead, it focused on usable, devastating performance. Officially rated at 335 horsepower and 445 pound-feet of torque, the CJ's true output was closer to 365 to 375 horsepower. That conservative rating wasn't a mistake. It allowed the engine to compete in favorable NHRA classes, where it crushed its rivals. More than 18,000 Mustangs received the 428 CJ between 1968 and 1970, giving it far greater street presence than the limited production Chevy 427 variants. For hardcore drag racers, the Super Cobra Jet added forged internals and tougher hardware, while Ram Air induction fed a massive Holley carburetor with cold, dense airflow. Where Chevrolet's 427 reflected engineering sophistication born of racing pedigree, Ford's 428 Cobra Jet showcased clever practicality. The Chevy featured advanced valve angles, rectangular port heads, forged cranks, and even aluminum blocks in special applications. It was an all-out, no-compromise design meant to win at the track. The Ford, by contrast, was a brilliant part spin creation, pairing a long-stroke block with proven 427 heads and delivering relentless low-end torque that drivers could actually use every day. It was the perfect example of two different paths to muscle car dominance, one built on racing purity, the other on street smarts. The 428 Cobra Jet was designed with practicality in mind. Its hydraulic camshaft kept the motor livable on city streets, while a cast iron intake and a moderate 10.6-to-1 compression ratio meant it could run reliably on pump gas. Unlike Chevrolet's racing-derived 427, this wasn't a track motor detuned for the street. It was a street engine intentionally built to dominate both drag strips and stoplight duels. By 1969, however, both engines began facing challenges that went far beyond raw horsepower. For Chevrolet, the 427's greatest strength quickly became its weakness. The motor was brutally powerful, but that very reputation attracted the attention of insurance companies who started hiking premiums for big block cars. On top of that, the exotic L88 and ZL1 versions demanded 103-octane fuel, which was becoming harder to find as environmental restrictions tightened. Manufacturing also posed problems. The Tonawanda plant could only produce a limited number of high-spec 427s due to specialized tooling, making them costly and complex to build compared to more mainstream engines. Chevrolet knew the future demanded higher volume, lower-cost options. Ford's 428 Cobra Jet, while less exotic, faced its own set of problems. The engine's deliberately underrated 335 horsepower claim had initially worked as a clever marketing and racing tactic, but it didn't take long for sanctioning bodies to catch on. Once the NHRA reclassified the CJ into tougher competition brackets, its sleeper advantage faded. Meanwhile, the tightening grip of emissions laws forced all manufacturers to rethink performance. The Clean Air Act brought compression ratios down and introduced restrictive emissions equipment. Both the 427 and the 428 CJ relied heavily on high compression and unrestricted airflow, two things that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain in the new regulatory environment. By the dawn of the 1970s, it was clear that both of these legendary engines were living on borrowed time. The end came quickly. In 1970, Chevrolet replaced the 427 with the 454 big block. Although it offered more displacement, lower compression ratios were necessary to meet emission standards, which blunted its performance. The short but glorious 4-year production run of the 427 instantly turned it into a collector's prize, with the rare L88 and ZL1 versions becoming some of the most valuable engines of the muscle car era. At auctions today, L88 Corvettes can reach into the millions, their racing pedigree ensuring they remain icons. Ford's 428 Cobra Jet lasted until 1970, after which it was phased out in favor of the newer 429 Cobra Jet from the 385 series engine family. The changeover caused some confusion since both motors were briefly offered at the same time. With over 18,000 Mustangs fitted with the 428 CJ between 1968 and 1970, survivors are far more common than Chevrolet's limited production 427s, which makes them slightly less exclusive in collector circles. Still, the CJ proved its worth both on the street and strip, with dyno testing later confirming what racers always suspected. Stock examples were producing well over their official 335 horsepower rating, often closer to 365 or more. In the end, both engines carved out very different but equally important legacies. The Chevy 427, especially in L88 and ZL1 form, symbolized the peak of no-compromise American performance engineering. A racing engine sold to the public regardless of cost or complexity. Its value and mystique continue to climb because of this pedigree. Ford's 428 Cobra Jet, on the other hand, democratized performance. It proved that with clever engineering and smart use of existing components, devastating results could be achieved without exotic materials or astronomical pricing. The CJ was the people's big block, and its reputation as a street terror remains intact decades later. Ultimately, the verdict depends on perspective.
The Chevy 427 embodied racing glory, while the 428 Cobra Jet embodied street domination. One chased perfection, the other pursued practicality and cunning. Together, they defined the muscle car wars of the late 1960s and continue to influence performance engineering to this day.